Most market crashes don't start with prices falling. They start with time being taken away, not time on a clock, time inside the financial system. Over the last few months, something specific changed in the most boring part of global finance. Nothing broke. Nothing froze. There was no headline and no warning. JP Morgan didn't stop lending. Goldman Sachs didn't exit markets. Bank of America didn't announce a retreat. Overnight transactions still cleared. Rates stayed calm. Liquidity still looked normal. But all three quietly stopped doing one thing automatically. They stopped extending time. Funding that used to roll for days without friction began rolling overnight, or only after someone actively approved it. Nothing failed, nothing snapped, but the system stopped assuming tomorrow. Late last year, JP Morgan Chase made a quiet adjustment to its short-term funding posture. There was no headline, there was no warning. Overnight transactions still cleared, the daily machinery still turned. What changed was not availability, it was how far into the future JP Morgan was willing to commit by default. Funding that would normally extend beyond overnight without friction, and that might roll for several days, stopped being automatic. It did not disappear, it did not fail, it simply started requiring a decision. That difference matters because in this node, time is not a background variable, time is the agreement. Granting time means committing the balance sheet. It means assuming tomorrow will look close enough to today that you won't regret being locked in. When a dominant dealer shortens its default horizon, it does not remove liquidity from the system. It moves the burden of duration onto someone else. And the system reacts immediately, not with panic, but with positioning. Goldman Sachs didn't exit repo markets, Goldman didn't pull liquidity, Goldman didn't announce anything. But the moment JP Morgan stopped treating term as routine, Goldman had to confront a simple question: who is carrying the extra days by default? Because someone always does. And Goldman responded the way large dealers respond when they don't want to become the silent warehouse for someone else's time. Not with drama, with friction. Term transactions still cleared, but haircuts widened slightly, not enough to stop the trade, enough to slow it, enough to make duration something you choose, not something you inherit. Maturities clustered closer to overnight, term was still possible, but less casual, less assumed. And then something changed that never shows up on a chart. Workflow changed. Trades that once rolled automatically at the desk started passing through internal checks. Capacity was confirmed. Balance sheet was signed off. Risk verified, it wouldn't be stuck holding exposure, it couldn't resize tomorrow. Most trades still cleared. The system still functioned. But the path to clearing now included a pause, a moment where someone had to actively decide. That pause is the fracture in miniature, not because it stops the system, because it replaces assumption with discretion. Bank of America adjusted in a parallel way, driven by a different pressure point, reporting windows and balance sheet elasticity. Bank of America didn't stop participating, it didn't declare a retreat. But as calendar boundaries approached, month-end and quarter-end, its matchbook appetite tightened. That doesn't mean no liquidity, it means shorter liquidity. Overnight, fine. 1 day, fine. 2 days, fine. But anything that pushed exposure across a boundary where balance sheet costs could change abruptly became more selective. It became more conditional. It became something you did only if you wanted to carry the time. This calendar boundary behavior is one of the cleanest behavioral tells in the node because it doesn't require you to interpret headlines. You can see it in the shape of the deals dealers are willing to make as those dates approach. Not a panic, not a freeze. A preference not to be caught holding duration at exactly the moment the balance sheet becomes least forgiving. And that's the key. This isn't about an institution being afraid. It's about an institution refusing to be trapped by time. When JP Morgan shortens, Goldman refuses to warehouse, and Bank of America tightens around boundaries, the system still clears. But it clears in tighter increments. The system moves the same cash, but it attaches less time to that cash. At the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, you can have a day where the totals still look normal, rates stable, operations smooth, and yet the behavior underneath tells a different story. Because when the market shortens, counterparties return more frequently. You can see it in how often the same players show up again. You can see it in how frequently positions are rolled instead of extended. You can see it in maturities compressing around reporting dates. The signal is not no liquidity. The signal is same liquidity, shorter commitment. This is where money market funds become load-bearing actors, not background characters. BlackRock, Fidelity, Vanguard, these are not small pools of cash. Their money market funds are major sources of short-term funding demand. Their maturity preferences shape tenor distribution. Their willingness to commit for a week versus a day changes the pressure on dealers. And once dealer behavior turns term into a decision instead of a default, money market funds respond in the only way that preserves their own optionality. They shorten. BlackRock's institutional liquidity funds tilt toward shorter weighted average maturities. That does not necessarily show up as outflows. It shows up as where the cash parks. More overnight repo, more same-day liquidity placements, less reliance on term instruments that assume the dealer network will remain equally willing to carry duration tomorrow. Fidelity follows a similar path. Vanguard follows. Not because they are predicting a crash, because they are responding to what dealers are willing to warehouse. This is the node teaching you without a lecture. When dealers add friction to term, money funds stop treating term as the default destination for cash. You can observe it without secret memos. You can also see it in maturity profiles, in tenor distributions, in the proportion of cash sitting overnight. Compared with 1 week and 2 week, volume can remain high. Duration can shrink anyway. That is the point. At this stage, price is often not the signal. Not because price does not matter, but because willingness can change before price has to. A market can clear smoothly at stable rates while participants quietly shorten every commitment. So you do not look for a spike, you look for a migration in tenor. Overnight share rises, 1 week shrinks, 2 week becomes harder to place without conversation. The same cash is still moving, but it is moving with less time attached. And once US cash pools shorten, the effect doesn't stay local. European banks feel it through their dollar funding channels. Institutions like BNP Paribas and Crédit Agricole don't suddenly lose access to dollars, but the tenor they can lock in without friction changes, because locking in tenor requires dealer balance sheet willingness. When US dealers are less willing to warehouse duration casually, extending foreign exchange swap tenors becomes less automatic. So those tenors shorten too. You can see it in how often positions roll. You can see it in maturity distribution shifting toward shorter resets. You can see it in the preference for rolling again tomorrow rather than committing across time. Again, not a disruption, a tighter leash. And then regulators respond, not with an announcement, but with posture. The Federal Reserve doesn't have to activate the standing repo facility for internal readiness to matter. The Federal Reserve can change modeling assumptions. It can update expectations about rollover frequency. It can adjust internal posture to reflect a world where more flows must renew more often. The ECB can refine collateral flexibility without telling the public what it is preparing for, because this isn't a public drama yet, it's private behavior, and private behavior is exactly what this node runs on. Short-term funding markets are built on renewal. Repo matures and rolls. Commercial paper must be refinanced. Interbank lines persist only as long as both sides agree to renew them. That has always been true. What is different is the texture of that renewal, whether it is treated as automatic or whether it is treated as a decision point. When the system is relaxed, desks choose term because it reduces how often they have to make the call. It reduces the number of renewals. It reduces the labor of constant decision making. When desks choose to do more labor, to renew more often, to approve more often, to roll more often, it means they want the option to change their answer. That is what is happening now. And it is happening through a chain of named actors, each constraining the next. JP Morgan shortens the default horizon. Term becomes conditional. Goldman refuses to become the residual holder. Haircuts and approvals introduce friction. Bank of America protects elasticity across calendar boundaries. Tenors compress near reporting dates. BlackRock, Fidelity, and Vanguard shorten maturities. Cash parks closer. Overnight share rises. BNP Paribas and Crédit Agricole shorten dollar funding tenors. Swaps roll more frequently. The Fed and ECB adjust posture. Internal assumptions track higher frequency renewal. No one has to say the words "we don't trust the system." The system says it in time, because time is trust here. The willingness to grant time is the willingness to commit balance sheet and assume tomorrow will look like today. What we are seeing is not a disappearance of liquidity, we are seeing a rationing of commitment. And the practical effect is simple. The system still functions, but it becomes less forgiving. Slack shrinks. Slack is what allows surprises to be absorbed without forcing behavior. Slack is what lets one counterparty hesitate without making the whole day feel different. As slack shrinks, more has to go right tomorrow. Not in a dramatic sense, just in the operational sense that the system requires continued renewal again and again, with fewer long bridges in place. This is not cascade logic. This is the present tense condition of the node, more frequent renewals, shorter commitments, more decision points. And that is why this phase is easy to miss, because nothing has failed. Repo still clears, commercial paper still rolls, interbank funding still exists, facilities remain unused. Yet the behavior inside the node is shifting toward reversibility. Now watch the details, because the details are where optionality gets lost. Dealer internal gating is one. When term trades require balance sheet sign-off, the desk can no longer treat duration as a free add-on. That changes how quickly term can be extended, how casually it can be offered, and how much of it can be carried without someone noticing. Calendar boundaries are another. Month-end and quarter-end are not events, they are dates. But in this node, dates matter because balance sheet treatment can change abruptly. So as those dates approach, the system naturally compresses. Not because someone is screaming, because no one wants to be caught holding time they cannot resize. Tenor distribution is the cleanest proxy. If you want a behavioral read without relying on a headline, you look for same cash, shorter commitment, you look for overnight share rising, 1 week share shrinking, 2 week becoming rarer. The system can remain busy and calm while that shift happens. And that shift tells you something you cannot get from a simple rate print. It tells you that participants are choosing to re-ask the question more often, which means they are preserving the ability to step back. Optionality is not a slogan here. Optionality is the ability to change your answer tomorrow. It is the ability to reduce exposure without being trapped by a term commitment you made yesterday. The system is still functioning, but it is functioning with less optionality offered freely, and that is the boundary. Not collapse, not contagion, constraint, a narrowing of what participants are willing to do automatically. Now, the most important part. This is still reversible. Everything described here can reverse tomorrow. JP Morgan could make term routine again. Goldman could tighten haircuts and remove approval friction. Bank of America could carry more matched book across reporting windows. Money funds could lengthen maturities again. European swap tenors could extend again. Regulators could relax internal posture assumptions again. Nothing has been forced. No one has been trapped by an event that locks behavior into a new regime. That is why this phase is unresolved, and that is why it matters, because the system is still running, and the way it is running has changed. It runs with shorter commitments. It runs with more frequent renewals. It runs with less slack. You can feel that in the simplest distinction inside the node, what used to be automatic is now conditional. This is not because the day has already turned into a crisis. It is because the institutions that make the day possible have decided that time should be granted in smaller pieces. That is the fracture, not what broke, what stopped extending.